The chill of the city streets pierced through Emma's thin jacket as she huddled in the corner of the alley. She pulled the edges of the cardboard tighter around her, trying to make herself as small as possible. The winds of Chicago had always been unforgiving in the winter, but tonight it felt different, colder, harsher, relentless. She had lost track of time, her mind numb from the cold and the constant noise of the bustling city around her. Cars honked, people shouted, and somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, but it all blurred into a haze. The city never stopped. Emma had learned to sleep on the streets, to find a sense of comfort in discomfort. She had no choice. She had learned not to rely on anyone, not to trust in anything that wasn't right in front of her. The streets were her reality now, cold, unforgiving, and full of people too busy with their own lives to notice her. She had long stopped hoping for something better. The dream of a warm bed, a safe place, had been shattered a long time ago. She wasn't even sure how long it had been since she'd last had a real home, since she'd last seen her mother, or even felt loved. The memory of her parents seemed like a distant echo, something she'd once known but had no longer access to. Tonight, like many others, Emma pulled her jacket tighter around her small body and curled into the makeshift bed she had made out of discarded cardboard. The streetlights flickered weakly above her, casting long shadows across the pavement. She had learned to ignore the discomfort, to push past the cold and the hunger, but tonight felt different. Tonight, something in the air made her shiver deeper into her shelter. She was about to drift off to sleep when a voice cut through the stillness. "Hey, are you all right?" The voice was soft, but carried a warmth that immediately caught Emma off guard. She opened her eyes, her heart racing as she quickly pulled herself further into her corner, instinctively drawing her body away from the man's silhouette looming over her. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Most people just walked by. Most people didn't care. But this man, he wasn't moving. His figure was framed against the glow of a streetlight, his features clear, and his eyes, though shadowed, seemed to focus directly on her. "Are you okay?" he repeated, his voice laced with something genuine. Concern, maybe? Emma squinted up at him, her heart still pounding in her chest. She was used to people ignoring her, used to the fact that no one really paid attention, but this man wasn't looking away. He was still standing there, staring down at her, his gaze steady and soft. Emma swallowed and took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what to say. Most nights, she had no words for anyone. She had no reason to speak, no reason to open up. But tonight, with this stranger standing before her, she felt something stir deep inside her, a flicker of hope, quickly buried under layers of doubt and fear. "I'm fine," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "It's not a bed, but it keeps the cold away." Her words were blunt, stripped of any emotion, as if she had said them 1,000 times before. She tried to curl back into her cardboard cocoon, to shield herself from the man's attention, but something about his presence kept her frozen. She didn't know if it was fear or curiosity that kept her still, but she couldn't look away. She wanted to escape, but couldn't. The man didn't move. He crouched down slowly, his movements calculated, as though trying not to startle her. Emma noticed the fine fabric of his suit, the polished shoes, the luxury that seemed out of place here on these cold, grimy streets. He seemed like someone who didn't belong in this part of town, yet here he was, kneeling in front of a homeless child like she was the most important thing in the world. The contrast between his clothes and the stark reality of her situation hit her like a blow. How many people like him had walked past her without a second glance? "Where are your parents?" he asked gently, his voice betraying a hint of unease. There was no accusation, no judgment, just a genuine question, one that Emma had heard too many times before, but from people who didn't care enough to listen to the answer. Emma didn't speak at first. She simply looked up at him, her wide, brown eyes filled with a wariness that only children who had learned to survive could possess. Her throat felt dry, her lips cracked from the cold, but she tried to find her voice. "I don't know," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, but it was the truth. Her parents were gone, vanished into the world long ago. The memory of them, especially her mother, seemed more like a story she had once been told, rather than a reality she had lived. "They left," she added quietly, the words hanging in the air between them. There was no bitterness in her voice, no sadness, just the cold fact that they had left her, and she had learned to survive without them. The man's eyes softened, a flicker of understanding passing across his face. "I'm Caleb," he said gently, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out something small, perhaps a card or a piece of paper. But he didn't push it on her. He didn't try to force her to take it. Instead, he just sat there, patiently waiting, offering nothing more than his presence. Emma looked at him for a long moment, unsure of what to say. She wasn't used to people offering help, let alone sitting down in front of her and actually trying to make her feel seen, even for a few seconds. "I'm fine," she repeated, though this time it felt less convincing, even to her. She had said it so many times in the past, but tonight the words didn't feel the same. Caleb looked at her for a long time, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to be fine. You're cold, you're alone, and you don't have to be either of those things. I can help." Emma's heart fluttered uncomfortably. She didn't trust anyone anymore, and help always came with strings attached. She didn't want help. She didn't want anything from anyone. But something in the man's eyes, something in his voice, made her hesitate. Her mind raced, fighting the instinct to shut down, to ignore him like she had ignored the rest of the world. She had learned to protect herself from others, to build walls so high that nothing, no one, could get through. But this man, this Caleb, wasn't like the others. He wasn't offering pity or charity. He was offering something different. And for the first time in a long time, Emma wondered if she could accept it. "Okay," she said softly, looking up at him. "What do you want from me?" Caleb smiled gently, a small, reassuring smile that made Emma feel both more vulnerable and more hopeful than she had in years. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I just want to help. You don't have to be alone anymore." There was something about his words that struck Emma deeply. She wasn't used to kindness. She wasn't used to people treating her like she mattered. But in that moment, she wanted to believe it. "Do you want to come with me?" Caleb asked. "I can get you something to eat. Warm food, something hot." Emma paused. The idea of hot food, of being somewhere warm, felt almost too good to be true. She looked down at the torn cardboard around her, at the broken world she had created for herself, and for the first time she considered that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. Caleb stood there for a moment, waiting for Emma's response. She had looked at him, her eyes wide and filled with that wariness he had seen in so many faces before, faces that had been through too much too soon, faces that had learned not to trust, not to hope. But when she finally spoke, it was a small, hesitant, "Okay." His heart gave a soft, involuntary thump in his chest. He didn't expect her to say yes. He had been prepared for rejection, for her to turn him away, but instead she had opened the door, even if only a crack. And that was all he needed. "All right," he said softly, offering her his hand. "Let's get you somewhere warm. I'll take you to the diner down the street. They've got the best grilled cheese sandwiches in town." Emma stared at his hand for a moment before slowly reaching out. Her hand was small and cold, the skin rough from exposure, but her grip was firm. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. As if, in that moment, Emma was making a decision that would change everything. She stood up, brushing the dirt and grime from her clothes, her eyes scanning the street around them. There was a moment of hesitation, as if she was afraid to leave her makeshift home, afraid to step into the unknown. But then, slowly, she followed Caleb as he led her away from the alley, towards the diner. The world outside seemed louder now, the sounds of traffic and bustling crowds filling the air. Caleb glanced down at Emma as they walked, noticing how small she looked next to him. She was so thin, so fragile. She looked like she belonged to a different world, one where children didn't have to survive on the streets. As they walked, Caleb thought about his own life. His penthouse, his office, the luxury that came with his success, none of it had ever felt like enough. None of it had ever filled the emptiness he sometimes felt. He had spent his entire adult life chasing success, working tirelessly, building an empire. And yet, in this moment, with Emma walking beside him, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. It was strange. How quickly something could change. How one encounter, one conversation, could make him feel like he was finally doing something meaningful. The diner came into view after a few minutes, its neon sign flickering in the night. Caleb opened the door, allowing Emma to step inside first. The warmth of the diner immediately enveloped them, the scent of fried food and coffee filling the air. It was a small place, nothing fancy, but it felt comforting in its own way. The waitress behind the counter looked up as they entered, a raised eyebrow at the sight of Caleb in his expensive suit, standing next to a young girl in ragged clothes. Caleb ignored the look, walking straight to a booth in the back. Emma hesitated at the entrance, her eyes darting around the room, unsure of how to behave in a place like this. "Don't worry," Caleb said gently, noticing her discomfort. "You're safe here. We're just going to sit down and get something warm to eat." Emma nodded, but still seemed out of place. Caleb slid into the booth first, then patted the seat next to him. Emma hesitated again, but finally joined him, sitting on the edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The waitress came over, her gaze flickering between them, but she didn't say anything. Caleb ordered 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and a milkshake for Emma. For himself, just a coffee. He figured that would be enough. The waitress took the order without a word and walked off, her curiosity still apparent. As they waited for the food to arrive, Caleb looked at Emma again. He wasn't sure what to say. What did you say to a girl who had been living on the streets? What words could offer any kind of comfort? "So," he began, breaking the silence, "what's your favorite food?" Emma blinked at him, as if the question caught her off guard. She looked down at the table for a moment, thinking. "I don't know," she said finally. "I haven't had food like this in a long time." Her voice was quiet, but there was a strange sense of honesty in it, as if she was speaking the truth without embellishment. Caleb smiled, leaning back in the booth. "Well, you're going to love this. The grilled cheese here is the best in the city. Trust me." Emma gave a small nod, her eyes shifting toward the window, where the lights from the street flickered against the glass. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the distant hum of conversations and the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. It wasn't awkward, but it wasn't comfortable either. Emma seemed to be in a world of her own, distant and wary. When the food arrived, Caleb slid a sandwich toward her. Emma's eyes lit up as she picked it up, but she didn't dive into it like Caleb expected. Instead, she took a small, tentative bite, savoring the warmth of it, as if afraid it would disappear too quickly. Caleb watched her closely, noting how she chewed slowly, almost reverently, as if this was the first real meal she had had in weeks. He reached for his coffee, watching her as she continued to eat, taking her time with each bite. The silence between them was comfortable now, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Do you want some more?" he asked, setting his cup down. Emma shook her head, looking up at him. "I'm good. Thank you." Caleb leaned forward slightly. "How long have you been on the streets?" he asked gently, his voice soft. Emma paused, her hands still wrapped around the sandwich. She glanced down at it, as if searching for the right words. "A while," she said finally. "I've been here for maybe 6 months." 6 months. Caleb's voice was thick with disbelief. "That's too long. A girl like you shouldn't have to be out here, alone." Emma didn't respond, but the way she looked down at her food told him everything he needed to know. She had been alone for so long that the idea of someone caring for her, someone offering her help, felt foreign, almost impossible. "I'm not going to let you stay out there any longer," Caleb said, his voice firm now. "You can come with me. I'll make sure you're taken care of. I'll figure it out." Emma looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any signs of insincerity. But there was nothing there but genuine concern. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb was taken aback by the question. "Why what? Why do you want to help me?" Emma asked. "You don't even know me. No one cares about me. Everyone always just leaves." Caleb's heart twisted at the raw pain in her words. He leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "Because I care. And because no one should ever have to feel like they don't matter." Emma swallowed, her eyes brimming with something Caleb couldn't quite place. Hope. Fear. It was hard to tell. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll go with you." Caleb smiled, a deep, genuine smile that seemed to reach every corner of his soul. "Good," he said simply. "Let's get you someplace safe." Caleb could feel the weight of Emma's gaze on him as they stepped out of the diner. The warmth inside had been a temporary relief, but now, back in the cold Chicago night, the stark reality of her situation settled in again. He glanced at her, noticing how her shoulders hunched against the wind, how her eyes darted nervously at the shadows that flickered in the dim light of the street. She didn't trust easily, and he couldn't blame her. The streets had taught her to be wary, to always be on guard. But in his heart, Caleb knew this wasn't just about one girl on the streets anymore. This was about offering something greater, about showing her that safety, warmth, and kindness were still possible. They walked side by side, but the silence between them felt heavy. Caleb had never been great with kids, let alone with someone who had experienced the kind of trauma that Emma clearly had. He was used to making deals, to navigating the cutthroat world of business, but this, helping a child like her, was uncharted territory. He wanted to ask more questions. He wanted to know everything about her, what had happened, how she ended up alone, what her life had been like. But he knew better than to rush it. He needed to earn her trust, not force it. As they turned the corner, Caleb took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. They had only walked a few blocks when a thought struck him. He couldn't let Emma continue living like this. He had to find a way to help her, to provide something stable. But the question remained, what could he offer her that would truly make a difference? The car ride back to his penthouse was quiet, the city lights flashing by like an endless stream of neon. Emma had kept her eyes focused out the window, her face expressionless. She hadn't asked where they were going, and Caleb hadn't told her. He didn't think she'd feel reassured by the idea of a stranger's home. After all, the streets had been her home for too long. When they arrived, Caleb parked in the garage, and as the engine hummed to silence, he turned to Emma. "You're not going to be alone tonight," he said, his voice steady, trying to offer a sense of reassurance that he wasn't entirely sure he felt himself. "I've got a guest room for you. We'll get you some new clothes, something warm to sleep in." Emma looked at him, her eyes calculating, but she didn't say anything. Caleb stepped out of the car first, then opened the door for her. Emma hesitated for a moment before sliding out, her tiny figure seeming so small against the towering buildings of the city. The contrast between her world and his could not have been more stark. They entered the building together, and Caleb led her to the elevator. As the doors closed, he glanced down at her, wondering what she was thinking. She seemed distant, lost in thought, and he understood. This was all too much, too fast. "I'm not asking you to stay forever," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "Just tonight. Tomorrow, we can figure out what comes next." Emma didn't respond. The elevator doors opened to the 15th floor, and Caleb led her down the hall. He opened the door to a room that was still largely untouched, perfectly arranged, minimalist and cold. There was a large bed, a few soft chairs, and a small desk. Caleb had never had much use for guest rooms, and now, looking at the sterile space, it suddenly felt alien. "Here we are," he said quietly. "I'll leave you to get some rest." Emma didn't move right away. Instead, she stood in the doorway, staring at the room as if it were an unfamiliar planet. This is your place?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes," Caleb replied. "I know it's not much, but it's clean, and it's safe." She didn't respond to that either. Instead, she walked inside, her footsteps tentative, almost hesitant, as if she were afraid to touch anything. She stopped at the edge of the bed, her fingers brushing the soft covers before she let out a deep sigh. Caleb stood at the door, unsure of how to leave her. This wasn't his world either. The idea of taking care of someone, especially a child who had been through so much, was daunting. He wasn't sure what was expected of him, what would make her feel safe. He'd been offering her help, but was it enough? "You can sleep here," he said, his voice catching. "I'll just be down the hall if you need anything. There's food in the fridge and—" "I'm fine," she interrupted softly, cutting him off before he could finish. She had a way of saying that, like she always had to be fine, even if she wasn't. "I'll leave you alone then," Caleb said, trying to smile, but it felt forced. He turned to leave, but something stopped him. Something about the silence in the room, the vulnerability in her tiny frame, made him pause. "Emma," he said, his voice softer now, "you're not alone anymore. You don't have to keep pretending." For the briefest moment, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something close to fear, but also something else. A glimmer of hope, of relief. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Good night," she murmured, her back turned to him as she sat on the edge of the bed. Caleb stepped back into the hallway, closing the door gently behind him. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the polished wood of the door. He had taken the first step, but the road ahead was uncertain. There was no map for what came next. He didn't know how to help her heal, but he knew he had to try. He walked down the hall to his own room, his thoughts spinning. His life had always been about control, about planning, making the right decisions. But this was different. He couldn't control this. He could only offer her a chance at something better, even if he didn't know what that something was. And yet, even as the night stretched on, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this was where he was meant to be. This wasn't just about Emma. It was about him too, finding a purpose that wasn't defined by business deals or profit margins. It was about offering kindness, about offering the kind of safety that he'd taken for granted his entire life. In the quiet of the night, he realized something he hadn't even known he'd been searching for. He had found a new reason to keep going. The following morning came far too quickly for Caleb. He had barely slept, his thoughts restless as he lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling. His mind kept drifting back to Emma, her small frame curled up on the bed in that sterile guest room, her face still shadowed with the unspoken history she carried. What was she thinking? Was she starting to feel safe, or was she just waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart again? Caleb knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He had no idea how to help a child like her, how to repair the broken trust she had in the world, let alone in him, a stranger who had walked into her life in the most unexpected way. He had the resources, the time, and the determination to give her a better life, but he couldn't make her trust him. That was something only Emma could give. The sound of a small tap at his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice thick with sleep. The door creaked open, and there stood Emma, dressed in the clothes Caleb had left for her, soft, faded jeans and a warm hoodie that seemed too big for her small frame. Her hair was still tangled from sleep, and her eyes were hesitant as they met his. "I'm hungry," she said, her voice a little more uncertain than usual. Caleb smiled, pushing himself off the bed. "You should be. Let's go get some breakfast." The moment he stepped into the kitchen, he felt that familiar tension in the air, as if Emma were still unsure of how to behave in this new, unfamiliar space. She stood by the door, her hands tucked into the pockets of her oversized hoodie, her gaze flicking around the room. The polished countertops, the gleaming appliances, and the space that felt too clean, too empty, all of it was so different from the world she had known. "Sit down," Caleb offered, motioning to the kitchen island. "I'll make us something simple." Emma nodded, but didn't move right away. Caleb couldn't help but notice the way she seemed to shrink into herself, as if she didn't quite belong here. He understood the feeling. This space was unfamiliar, and she was still a stranger in it, still unsure of what to expect. He busied himself with making a pot of coffee, knowing that Emma would need time. He didn't want to rush her, didn't want to push her too fast into something she wasn't ready for. He'd learned that much about helping others. Patience was the key. "Do you like eggs?" he asked casually as he cracked a couple into a pan. Emma shifted on her seat, pulling her legs up onto the stool and wrapping her arms around her knees. "I don't know. I haven't had them in a while." Caleb turned to look at her. Her voice was small, almost as if she wasn't used to expressing what she needed, what she wanted. "Well, today's a good day for eggs," Caleb said, trying to sound as light-hearted as possible. "They're my favorite." Emma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced out the window, her gaze distant, lost in thought. Caleb knew it wasn't the eggs she was thinking about. There was so much more going on inside her head, and he could see it. But she wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. The sound of eggs sizzling in the pan filled the silence, and for a moment Caleb let the quiet wash over him. He wasn't sure what the next step was, but he was trying to stay present for her, trying to offer what little comfort he could. When the eggs were ready, Caleb placed a plate in front of Emma, along with a glass of juice. He set his own plate down across from her, watching as she slowly took a bite. Her hesitation was palpable, but she didn't pull away. She chewed slowly, as if savoring each bite, but her expression was still guarded, almost as if she were waiting for the moment when it would all fall apart again. "Thank you," she said softly after a while. Caleb looked up, surprised by the words. He hadn't expected her to thank him. It was such a small thing, but to Emma it felt like a big step. "You're welcome," Caleb replied, his voice gentle. "I'm glad you like it." For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Caleb watched as Emma finished her breakfast, taking each bite with a kind of quiet reverence. She was hungry, yes, But there was something more, something that went beyond just food. She was hungry for something else, something that had nothing to do with food at all. After she finished, she placed her plate down gently, as if handling something fragile. She looked up at him, her eyes still filled with that same mixture of caution and curiosity. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb's heart ached as he considered her question. What did happen now? He didn't have all the answers, and he knew it wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. But he was determined to help her, to show her that there was something better waiting for her than the streets. "Well," he began, taking a deep breath, "now we take it one step at a time. I'll help you get settled. We can look for a school for you, get you some clothes, and we'll figure out what comes next. But for now, you don't have to worry about anything." Emma nodded slowly, though there was still doubt in her eyes. Caleb knew it wouldn't be easy to convince her. Trust wasn't something that could be given freely, especially when the world had been nothing but cruel to her. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said, his voice gentle. Emma looked at him, her brow furrowed. "Sure," she said, her voice barely audible. "Why did you leave the shelter?" he asked softly. He hadn't wanted to ask, not yet, but the question had been on his mind since the moment they had talked. She had run away, and Caleb needed to understand why. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She avoided his gaze, focusing instead on her hands, which were tightly clasped in her lap. It wasn't a good place," she said after a long pause. "There were too many rules. I didn't like it. I wanted to find my mom. She said she would come back for me. I thought if I just kept looking, I'd find her." Caleb felt a pang in his chest at her words. A child shouldn't have to feel like that, shouldn't have to run away from a place that was supposed to protect them. He didn't know the full story yet, but he could see that Emma had been through far more than any child should ever experience. "I understand," he said softly, "but you don't have to keep searching on your own. You're safe now. I'll help you find your mom." Emma's eyes flickered up to his, and for the briefest moment, Caleb saw something, maybe a flicker of hope, maybe a little less fear. But it was there, and that was all that mattered. "I promise," Caleb said, his voice firm with conviction. "We'll figure it out together." The days that followed were a delicate balance between silence and tentative steps toward trust. Caleb had always prided himself on being in control, but with Emma there were no clear answers, no easy solutions. Each morning he woke up with a resolve to do better, to offer her something more than the cold reality of the world she had known. Yet each night he lay awake, wondering if he was doing enough. Emma, too, seemed to struggle with the uncertainty of her new life. She had accepted Caleb's offer, but it wasn't easy for her to let go of the habits formed by years of survival on the streets. She was cautious, always watching, always calculating. There was no room for vulnerability in her world, no room for dependence on anyone else. But little by little, Caleb saw cracks in her armor. He wasn't sure when it happened, but he could sense it, an unspoken bond that had begun to form between them. One morning, Caleb walked into the kitchen to find Emma already seated at the island, a bowl of cereal in front of her. She had been there for a while, he realized, sitting in the stillness, her eyes far away. "Good morning," Caleb greeted her softly, taking a seat across from her. Emma nodded without looking up, her fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the edge of the table. Caleb noticed how stiff her posture was, how she still seemed like a stranger in his home, despite the days that had passed. But there was something different in the way she held herself, something more at ease, though only slightly. "Did you sleep well?" Caleb asked, trying to break the silence. Emma glanced up at him, her eyes briefly meeting his before she quickly looked away. "Yeah," she replied, her voice quiet. "It was okay." Caleb nodded, understanding. "That's good." They fell into another silence, and for a moment Caleb wondered if he should say something more. But he didn't want to rush her. He knew better than to push too hard. Instead, he got up and made a pot of coffee. The smell filled the room, and for the first time in days, he noticed a small shift in the atmosphere. Emma didn't look as distant. She was still reserved, but there was a subtle change in her. The way her shoulders were less hunched, the way her hands weren't clenched so tightly. After a few minutes, Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee and returned to the table. He set the cup in front of Emma, offering it to her without a word. She looked at it for a long moment, almost as if unsure of what to do with it, before finally taking a sip. "Thanks," she muttered, and this time her voice held a hint of something. Gratitude, maybe, or acceptance. Caleb wasn't sure, but it was a small victory. They ate breakfast in silence, but this time the silence felt less heavy. It was a quiet comfort, the kind that came from simply sharing space without the need for constant conversation. Emma finished her cereal quickly and stood up, her eyes glancing at the clock on the wall. "I'm going out," she said, her voice neutral, though Caleb could hear the faintest trace of unease in her tone. Caleb looked up at her, surprised. "Where are you going?" Emma hesitated. "Just out. I'll be back later." Before Caleb could say anything else, she turned and walked out the door, leaving him sitting at the table, staring after her. He knew she wasn't ready to open up fully, not yet. But he also knew she couldn't keep living in isolation, in fear. She needed to learn to trust again, and that would take time. Later that afternoon, Caleb found himself sitting in his office, his thoughts constantly drifting back to Emma. He knew she was still processing everything, still unsure of what her future held, but he couldn't help feeling like he was failing her. He had promised to help her, to give her a better life, but how could he do that when she was so unwilling to let anyone in? His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Vanessa, his assistant. "How's everything going with Emma? I've made a few calls for you regarding some local schools. Let me know when you're free to discuss." Caleb sighed and set the phone back down. He had to focus, had to stay patient. He couldn't push Emma too hard, but he also couldn't let her slip through his fingers. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out over the city. The view was breathtaking, skyscrapers reaching toward the sky, the hustle and bustle of the streets far below. But in the midst of all the chaos, Caleb felt a growing sense of responsibility for Emma. She had no one but him now. He wasn't sure how he had ended up in this position. He had spent years building a career, a reputation, and a life based on strategy, on the pursuit of success. But this, helping a lost child, wasn't something he had ever planned for. It wasn't something you could prepare for. It was raw, it was uncharted, and it was terrifying. But it was also the most important thing he had ever done. That evening, when Emma returned, Caleb was still in the kitchen, reading through some documents. He heard the sound of the front door opening and closing softly, followed by footsteps in the hallway. She walked in, her eyes scanning the room quickly before she met his gaze. "Hey," she said, her voice a little less guarded than before. "I just needed some air." Caleb set the papers down and looked at her. "I understand. I'm glad you're back." Emma stood by the door for a moment, her hands shoved into the pockets of her hoodie. She looked smaller than usual, more vulnerable somehow, as if the weight of everything she had been through was finally catching up to her. "I went to the park," she said quietly, her voice distant. "It was Nice. For a minute, I didn't feel like I was just running. Caleb's heart tightened at her words. I'm glad you went, he said softly. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve to have peace. Emma looked at him, and for the first time since he met her, Caleb saw something in her eyes, something like trust, like a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. I'm sorry for running off, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what else to do. You don't have to apologize, Caleb replied, standing up. It's okay. You're allowed to be uncertain. You don't have to have all the answers. Emma nodded slowly, then hesitated before speaking again. I don't want to be a burden, she said quietly, her voice laced with a vulnerability Caleb hadn't heard from her before. You're not a burden, Caleb said firmly, walking toward her. You never were. You're just someone who needs help, and I'm here for that. I'm here for you. Emma's eyes flickered with something. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of it. And for a moment, Caleb saw the girl she could be, not just the survivor of a broken past. He stepped closer, offering her the kind of safety he had promised her, the kind of care she had been missing for so long. And for the first time, Emma didn't pull away. She let him in. The next few days passed slowly, each one a quiet step forward in Emma's healing process. Caleb kept his promises. He didn't rush her, didn't force her to talk or confront the past. He simply offered her a safe space, a place where she could start to build new memories, however small. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for the first time in years, Emma felt a flicker of hope. Every morning, Caleb made breakfast, simple things like oatmeal with fruit or scrambled eggs. They ate together, and although the conversations were brief and often awkward, they felt real. Caleb didn't pressure Emma to open up about her past. He let her share when she was ready, or when the silence grew too loud. Little by little, the walls she had built around herself started to crumble. She wasn't completely there yet, far from it, but the changes, however small, were noticeable. One afternoon, Caleb found her sitting on the couch, her eyes glued to the TV. She was watching an old cartoon, something about a rabbit and a turtle, a story she probably hadn't seen in years, if ever. The sound of the show filled the room with laughter and cheerful music, but Emma's face remained unreadable. She was still holding the distance, still unsure if she could truly embrace this life that Caleb had offered her. He walked over quietly, sitting beside her. "Do you want to go for a walk later?" he asked, breaking the silence gently. He had noticed that she had been staring out the window more often lately, as if lost in thought, caught somewhere between wanting to move forward and being afraid to leave the past behind. Emma glanced at him, her expression a little less guarded than it had been before. "I guess," she said, her voice soft. "It's just, I've never really been anywhere, you know? The street is the only place I've ever known. I don't know what to do with anything else." Caleb nodded, understanding more than she knew. "You don't have to know right now. We can just take it one step at a time. No pressure. You're not alone in this." Emma stayed quiet for a moment, her gaze flickering back to the screen. The smile on the cartoon turtle's face seemed to catch her attention for a brief second. It was an innocence, a simplicity that she hadn't known in years, and for a fleeting moment, Caleb saw something in her, something like nostalgia or longing. "You really think I'm not alone?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't made eye contact, but Caleb could hear the vulnerability in her tone, a question she had been too afraid to ask for a long time. "I know you're not alone," Caleb said, his voice firm but gentle. "You've got me, Emma, and you've got a future here. Whatever that looks like, it's yours to build." She looked at him then, her brown eyes full of confusion, as though the words he spoke couldn't quite sink in. But Caleb saw the tiniest shift, the briefest flicker of something in her gaze. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the beginning of trust. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, Caleb suggested they go for a walk in the park. The weather had cooled, but it wasn't too cold, and the crisp air felt refreshing after being cooped up inside. Emma hesitated for a moment, but then, without saying a word, she slipped on a jacket Caleb had gotten for her a few days ago. It was a simple, dark blue jacket, but it was warm and fitting, something that seemed to suit her more than the old, worn-out hoodie she had been wearing. They walked side by side through the park, the sounds of children playing and families enjoying the evening a distant hum in the background. For a while, neither of them spoke, but the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. Caleb simply walked beside her, allowing her the space to think, to process. After a while, Emma stopped by the swings, her eyes scanning the empty park around them. She hadn't spoken much since they left the apartment, but Caleb wasn't surprised. It was as if she was still adjusting to the idea of being outside, of being in a place that wasn't the street or her old shelter. "You know," Caleb said, breaking the silence, "I used to love swinging when I was a kid. It was my favorite thing to do in the park." Emma glanced at him, her gaze softening slightly. "You did?" Caleb nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah. It was the closest I ever got to flying, I guess. Just the feeling of the wind against your face. It made everything feel a little less complicated." Emma tilted her head, considering his words for a moment. "I don't know if I ever felt like that," she said slowly. "I never really got to play. I was too busy just surviving." The admission hung in the air between them. It was raw, real, and it tugged at Caleb's heart more than he expected. He had known Emma had been through a lot, but hearing her say it out loud made it all the more real. "You know, you're allowed to have fun too," Caleb said softly, watching her face closely. "You don't have to carry everything by yourself anymore. You can enjoy things, even if it's something small, like a swing." Emma didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at the empty swings for a moment, her eyes distant. Caleb could see the wheels turning in her mind, the doubts, the fears, all vying for attention. But for a brief moment she seemed to relax, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "I don't know if I can," she murmured, almost to herself. "You can," Caleb said firmly, his voice gentle but certain. "It's okay. You don't have to have it all figured out. Just take it one step at a time. We'll figure it out together." Emma looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his with a depth that surprised him. For a moment, it felt as if time stood still. She wasn't the same guarded, closed-off girl from the alley anymore. She was opening up, little by little, and that was all Caleb needed to see. "I'll try," she said quietly. Caleb smiled. "That's all anyone can do." They stood there for a few moments longer, the cool breeze rustling the leaves above them. Then, as if a sudden thought occurred to her, Emma walked over to the swings, hesitating for a second before sitting down. She gripped the chains, her fingers tightly clutching them as she slowly began to move back and forth. It was a small, simple act, but to Caleb it was a sign of something much bigger. Emma was starting to believe in herself again. She was starting to trust that the world could offer her something more than pain, something more than survival. As the evening wore on, Caleb and Emma continued their walk, each step a little lighter than the last. They talked about small things, places they wanted to visit, food they wanted to try, the kind of things that people who had a future talked about. And for the first time, Emma allowed herself to dream, if only for a little while.